Being the first day of October, I think maybe it is acceptable that I speak about a subject that is slightly involved around the idea of death. I think there's a sense in which we are fascinated by death. Maybe it's the finality of it all. I know as Christians we recognize that is simply not the truth, but as a people in whole, this idea, this concept, is there anything after death? Is death truly the end? All of these questions kind of come together to swirl into our fascination with the idea of the dead. Because of this, I think things that relate to or are surrounding this concept become of particular fascination when we're talking about someone who is noteworthy, someone who is famous. An example of that would be famous sayings of people or famous last words. Sometimes those phrases are somewhat funny, such as the murderer James Rogers, who was being put before a firing squad, when asked if he had any last requests, simply replied, "Bulletproof vest." Or the Union General John Sedgwick, he spoke his last words as a complaint to his cowering troops who had advised him to not stand out in the open. "Nonsense," he said. "They couldn't hit an elephant from this distance." Those were his last words. Sometimes last words are profound. John Wesley, shortly before dying, said, "The best of all is this: God is with us." And William Henry Seward, who was the U.S. Secretary of State and close friend to Abraham Lincoln, asked if he had any final words on his deathbed, replied, "Nothing, only love one another." That brings me to my purpose of this lesson, to consider for a moment some of the final statements of Jesus. Now, something obvious, I think, for us to realize is that our words, our final maxims, are kind of hard for us to judge what they will be because we do not know the appointed hour in which we will give up our life. But Jesus did. Jesus knew exactly when his life was coming to an end. And something of note, John records in John 21, verse 25, that if we could have all the recordings of what Jesus said and what Jesus did, that the entire world couldn't contain the books that could be written. But the Holy Spirit did deem it necessary to record some of the last things that Jesus taught. And I find it interesting the things that he chose to record, to draw to the mind of John as he wrote these things down. Were they great theological treatises of how to understand the nature and magnitude of God? No. Or did he spend that time trying to scold his disciples for the many, many mistakes that they made in his short ministry? Again, no. What were the final teachings of Jesus? As we'll see in just a moment, they were blueprints for what would become his body, the church. In John chapter 15, verses 18 through 19, Jesus taught his disciples shortly before dying, "If the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you." Jesus' final teachings included teaching that the church was going to be separate. It was going to be a separate entity from the world, and that there was going to be conflict, and there was going to be a stark difference between the world and the church. In John chapter 13, 34 and 35, he said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Jesus taught that the church was going to be filled with those who had an unconditional love, a love they would pour out for one another, a love that would be evident in their lives in such a way that this world that was separate and apart from them would see, would recognize. Then lastly, John chapter 14, verse 1 and John 14, 21, Jesus said, "Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will disclose myself to him. Jesus taught that this body, the church, would have a deep trust in him that was evident through their lives of obedience, which were produced through this trust. Now, I bring all these up to share with you something a little bit unorthodox. There's been a few of you who have commented on my sermon this morning that it was a little bit different. Hadn't maybe heard a sermon like that before. And I don't know how to take that. But I'm taking it as good. But I'm going saying that to say this, tonight's sermon is going to be a little bit unorthodox as well. Because what I want to share with you are letters and examples from 2nd to 4th century Christians who heard these same words that you just read. The Word of God that has continued to echo and make ripples throughout history fell upon their ears. And what I want us to consider is how it impacted them. Some of the 1st century and 2nd and 3rd and 4th century disciples of Christ. And I'm going to recognize, and I want you to recognize, what we read tonight, they're not authoritative and inspired words, but I would argue that they're true, and they're honorable, and they're right, and they're pure, and they're lovely, and they're of good repute, and they're deserving of us dwelling on them for a moment. So one of the first things I want to consider, taking these last teachings of Jesus, is how his teaching brought about a people who were not of this world. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters." And since saying those words, mankind, and specifically his disciples, seem like they have tried to set out on a path to prove Jesus wrong. Jesus, I know you said that, but I think it's possible. Let me show you how. When we seek the things of God and we seek the things of this world, that is what we are doing. We are seeking out to show that there is a way we can serve two masters. And so what I want you to reflect on for a moment as we get into this is this question. If you could take your life and just kind of pick it up, the whole of your life, what you do, what you think, what you say, if you could pick that up and just lay it out on an examination table, and then find the life of another, a non-Christian, non-believer, but strongly conservative American. And you lay their life on the observation table, the things that they think and they do and they say. What differences would you see? Now, take away worship, take away time spent together with brethren and singing and worshiping God. Take that away. What differences do you find in the way that you spend your time pursuing after materialistic things, or in the way that you pursue entertainment? What differences or what things do you see that are the same? Do you fret over the same types of problems? What I wonder is, will we find that when Jesus told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world," if his disciples haven't taken that phrase and thought of it more as a theory rather than a practice that was being made evident in their lives? I am not of this world. Having said that, let me share with you our first letter. It comes from an unknown author during the time of the first couple of centuries. And this is a letter that has been written from a Christian to a Roman, explaining something about the Christians. It says, "They dwell in their own countries simply as sojourners. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time, they surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, but are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death, but will be restored to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They possess few things, yet they abound in all. They are dishonored, but in their very dishonor are glorified. And those who hate them are unable to give any reason for their hatred." Again, I ask you to read these things just to kind of get a snapshot, a picture of the same people who heard the same words that we did as we read Jesus' closing remarks of his life. The world is different from my kingdom. And the people who live in my kingdom will live differently from the world. Listen to how that affected those of this earlier time frame. Justin Martyr, who was a converted Christian, he used to be a pagan in the early hundreds AD. He was a pagan that converted to Christianity and became an evangelist to tell others the good news of Jesus, said this: "Since our thoughts are not fixed on the present, we are not concerned when men put us to death. Debt is a debt we must all pay anyway." Or Cyprian, an elder in the church in Carthage, he wrote this to a Christian friend. I want you to think about this, the sort of conversations that are going on between Christians. "The one peaceful and trustworthy tranquility, the one security that is solid, firm, and never changing is this: for a man to withdraw from the distractions of this world, anchor himself to the firm ground of salvation, and lift his eyes from earth to heaven. He who is actually greater than the world can crave nothing, can desire nothing from this world. How stable, how unshakable is that safeguard, how heavenly is the protection in its never-ending blessings. To be free from the snares of this entangling world, to be purged from the dregs of the earth, and fitted for the light of eternal immortality." These are the ways that some of these early Christians would have, they conversed with one another, and they shared what was going on in their lives, and they said, "Think about this, brother, that we have been set free, that we have a brand new hope," and the way that that changes how we see the things of this earth, both the glorious things of this earth and the persecutions and suffering that we feel as well. One last letter on this comment of people not of this world actually doesn't come from a Christian. It comes from an antagonist to Christianity, someone who despised the Christians. And he writes this as a description of the Christians of his day. And certainly there's going to be things that he says that are simply not true theologically. But I want you to consider how he describes the people that he witnessed. "They despise the temples as houses of the dead. They reject the gods. They laugh at sacred things. Wretched, they pity our priests. Half naked themselves, they despise honors and purple robes. What incredible audacity and foolishness! They are not afraid of present torments, but they fear that which is uncertain in future. While they do not fear to die for the present, they fear to die after death. Living in suspense and anxiety, you abstain from respectable pleasures. You do not attend sporting events. You have no interest in public amusements. You reject the public banquets and abhor the sacred games. Thus, wretched as you are, you will neither rise from the dead nor enjoy life in the meanwhile. So if you have any wisdom or sense, stop prying into the heavens and the destinies and the secrets of the world." Does that sound like somebody that Paul might have wrote about in 1 Corinthians, talking about the wisdom of the world? Obviously, there's some things that are not true there about what is to be expected and what Christians understand to be true. But do you see what he recognized, what he saw, is a people who do not fit in. They stand out from the world because they lived as people that were not of the world. And as I read these letters, and especially the criticisms that we just read, I have to ask myself, and I ask you as well, who would accuse Christians today of the same things? Where are our criticisms? Being mocked for being totally obsessed with the interests of this heavenly kingdom. And are we ridiculed for ignoring the things that this world has to offer? On the contrary, I would submit that more often than not, Christians are not mocked or ridiculed. I'm not saying persecution doesn't exist, but more often than not, we're not mocked and we're ridiculed. We're chastised for being hypocrites. Preaching the kingdom, preaching that we are members of a kingdom of a other world, a heavenly kingdom, but living like the residents of this earth. Disciples of Christ must remember, we are citizens of a heavenly kingdom. We must also recognize another strong characteristic of the early church that was depicted by hearing the words of Christ, and it was a picture of love. Jesus noted, John 13, that by our love the world would know that we are His disciples, if we have love for one another. And so again, I ask you to consider some of these early sketches of Christianity that are depicted in some of their letters. Justin Martyr again wrote, describing Christian love this way: "We who used to value the acquisition of wealth and possessions more than anything else now bring what we have into a common fund and share it with anyone who needs it. We used to hate and destroy one another, and we refused to associate with people of another race or country. Now, because of Christ, we live together with such people and pray for our enemies." The historian Eusebius records a devastating plague that swept through the ancient world in the 3rd century, and people were dying left and right, but Christians, he notes, were the ones, and some of the only ones, who cared for the sick, which they did at the risk of catching this plague themselves. He records that this was during a time when many pagans would take their family, even their loved ones, and would cast them out into the street, sometimes before they were even dead, so as to preserve their lives, to guard themselves from catching the sickness. It was at this time that Christians shown themselves to the world as people that were filled with love. I want you to think about that. In light of, and I'm not trying to compare them, in light of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, did Christian love reveal itself in the same way so that the world said, we need to take note, something is different about those people? Another interesting story involves a pagan actor who became a Christian, and he realized that his employment had needs to be changed. He couldn't continue on in the job that he had, because plays oftentimes represented and encouraged immorality, and they were very often focused around pagan idolatry. And so he said, I need to be not a part of this. There were things that happened that just should not and could not coincide with the life of a Christian. Young boys would be taken and sometimes purposefully encouraged and made into homosexuals so that they could better play the part of a woman. And this Christian looked at this and recognized, I can't continue in this. But that's my job. It's the only way that I provide for my family. It's the only way that I provide for myself. And so he's got to figure out a means by which to continue to make a living. And so he concocts this idea. I was a very good actor, and maybe I can open a school. And obviously I will keep back the immoral things and will not encourage or teach those things, but I will become a teacher of future actors. Here's what's amazing about this account. He goes to his eldership and he submits his idea for employment before his eldership, asking for their counsel. Is this a good idea for me? And asking for them to pray for his situation. Now the eldership, they discuss it and they decide that if there are things that are sinful in this line of employment, teaching others how to do it is not something that a Christian should be involved in. But they write a letter to their friend Cyprian, who we mentioned earlier, an elder that was residing in Carthage, and they said, hey, what do you think about this? And here's one thing that really stands out about this. Cyprian writes back and says, you're right, probably shouldn't be involved in that. That's not a good thing for Christians to do. Have you thought about what your responsibility is to this young man? Have you thought about how he's not going to have clothes and he's not going to have food, and you have a responsibility to care for him? And if you're not in a position to do that financially, if there's not somebody there that can help with that, you send him to Carthage and we'll do it. And here's what stood out, I thought was amazing about this historical note. One is the love that this Christian had for God and for his ways. How many of us are going to take our proposed employment ideas and bring them to an eldership and say, hey, do you approve? Do you think this is a good idea? Is this a place? Is this a path that's going to be good for me and glorify God? If not, I'll do something else. But also, the church in Carthage didn't have any idea who this person was. They didn't know him. They just knew that he was a believer. and the brotherhood cares for the brotherhood. Over and over again, we get pictures such as this. But it's not just pictures of brethren caring for brethren. It wasn't just love towards one another they practiced. Another historian notes this. Prior to the advent of modern medicine, most societies utilized a form of exposure. If you don't know what exposure is, he says exposing a child was thought of as the best way of saving an infant from a life of impoverishment or disability. And so what he's describing is something that was very common in the Roman society. You have a child that is not pleasing, or maybe has a disability, or is just a hindrance and not what you wanted in your life. They decided it was safer and it was better for them to take the child and to go and lay it outside somewhere and just let it die. And we, rightfully so, are upset by this and heartbroken by this, but must also recognize that our society isn't somehow better than that, with the untold millions of children who are aborted each and every year. But there is one thing that exposure had that abortion doesn't, and that was the opportunity for someone to come by and rescue it. In fact, this was oftentimes the reason for exposure being viewed as better. It wasn't just safer for the woman, but it was also an opportunity for the child, in which maybe somebody would come by. And there was three realities for children in this state. One was death. The other one was slavery and prostitution. When somebody would come by with less than goodwill in mind for this child that can be put into their service. The third was Christian adoption. And I'm going to just kind of air quote that, because it's not adoption in the way that we sense. There was no legal rights, no legal title given to these children, but they were taken in nonetheless. Sometimes taken in only for a few short days as their lives were extinguished due to what they had been through. But other times taken in for a lifetime with a parent that is dedicated to providing for them and caring for them and loving them and teaching them the gospel. And it's this that Ignatius warns the church about. He says to note well those with a heretical opinion of the grace of Jesus Christ, which are held by those who are contrary to the mind of God, saying they have no concern for love, none for the widow, none for the orphan, none for the oppressed. In light of the way that these words impacted early believers, it's no wonder that Christianity spread through the ancient world so rapidly. And please note, it spread without missionary societies. It spread without programs to outreach and to care. It was spread by disciples, by Christians who made it their goal to do exactly as Christ had done. They loved, and the practice of their love drew the attention of the world, just as Jesus said that it would. Disciples of Christ, they love without condition. And lastly, I want you to consider how the early Christians thought about trusting God. And it couldn't be confined to a moment. They couldn't describe it as, here's the moment that I came to trust in the Lord. Instead, it was intricately tied up with a belief that was coupled with obedience. Clement of Rome declared, a person who does not do what God has commanded shows he really does not believe God. A quote that is no doubt inspired by 1 John 2:4, which says, the one who says, I have come to know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. In fact, one early Christian was recorded as saying this. I really, by the way, really love this one. He says, we do not speak great things, we live them. I don't know how, and I could never prove it, but that right there is some great, great, great ancestor to Brad Harris. And in 2,000 years, if there isn't somebody that digs up something that says the Christians in Somerset, Kentucky were saying, we'll do the next right thing, I'm going to be just a little bit disappointed. Early Christians didn't feel like they had to understand a reason for all this. Why did God command it? Why does God desire this? Why is it done this way? Instead, they simply obeyed it with a childlike trust that God's way was best and that he was able and willing and trustworthy to bring a person through whatever it was they were facing to be in his presence. Let me share with you how another Christian put it. This is Felix, who was a lawyer in Rome. He said, God is greater than all our perceptions. He is infinite, immense. Only He truly understands His greatness. Our hearts are too limited to really understand Him. We are making a worthy estimation of Him when we say that He is beyond estimation. Anyone who thinks he knows the magnitude of God diminishes His greatness. But I think maybe the greatest example of this childlike trust was their acceptance of persecution. Early on in the days of Christianity, ranging as far back as the 50s, 60s, 70s AD, all the way to the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, it was illegal to practice Christianity within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And while officials didn't usually seek out Christians, if someone came and said, so-and-so is a Christian, they would be brought before a tribunal of some sort, and they would be asked, will you recount, will you denounce this Jesus of Nazareth? And everything will be forgiven. You repent, we'll forgive you. But if you refuse to do that, you face death. This was the reality of Christians living in this day. And I want you to consider one such Christian, a man by the name of Origen. He wrote to the Romans this: when God gives the tempter permission to persecute us, we suffer persecution. When God wished us to be free from suffering, even though surrounded by a world that hates us, we enjoy a wonderful peace. We trust in the protection of the one who said, "Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." And truly He has overcome the world. Therefore the world prevails only as long as it is permitted to by Him who received power from the Father to overcome the world. From His victory we take courage. And even if He should again wish us to suffer and contend for our faith, let the enemy come against us. We will say to them, "I can do all things through Christ Jesus my Lord, who strengthens me." Origen lost his father to persecution as a teenager, and he himself would die from torture and imprisonment due to his beliefs. And with confidence, some of his final words were this: eventually every form of worship will be destroyed except the religion of Christ, which alone will stand. In fact, it will one day triumph, for its teachings take hold of men's minds more and more each day. Disciples of Christ obey with a childlike trust of their Father. As I said at the beginning of this, brethren, I understand this is a bit of an unorthodox sermon. It's not your typical book, chapter, and verse sermon. And I fully admit that even some of the things that we put on the screen tonight and the people that we talked about held views that were at times problematic, at other times downright in error. But I bring these letters to your attention today for this reason. I want to ask you to do one thing. I want you to ask yourself, am I a disciple of Jesus Christ? And do I live as if I belong to another kingdom? Today, if you are not a Christian, if you are not a child of God, I think it would do well for you to know what Paul says in Romans chapter 6 and verse 17. He says, "Thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed. And having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." Apart from Christ, apart from His sacrifice, that is exactly what we are. Enslaved to sin. And all the things that we may face and all the things that go on in this world, whether because we are believers or just because we live in a fallen world, are absolutely worthless. And we have no hope. The beauty of this passage is this: we don't have to stay that way. We have a Father who has sought us out, who desires to adopt us into His family. He said, "You were enslaved to sin, but freedom has been proclaimed to you." But note well what He said after that. Being freed from sin, you become a slave to righteousness. Are we living as one devoted or captured by the righteousness of God? Does our life show that we are disciples of Jesus Christ? Does it reveal that we are members of a new kingdom? If not, then ask yourself, have I returned to the world? James 4, verse 4 says that friendship with the world is enmity with God. If there is something that we can do today to assist you in coming to Jesus, to be set free from your sin, or in returning to Him, to redevote yourself as a disciple of His who has been impacted by His Word. I am not a member of this world. I'm a member of your kingdom. And I will show that through my love, and I will show that through my trust. However we can assist you with that this evening, please come forward and let's talk about that together as we stand and as we sing.